What's up everybody, I'm back for my third YouTube video with my new and improved setup. If you have followed me recently, subscribed, or watched any of my videos, thank you so much. This is a new endeavor for me and doing something new is always scary, so it really makes me feel a lot better, and it's really amazing that you guys are watching and already liking some of the stuff that I'm putting out. So today I'm actually going to make a video about preparing for technical interviews as an intern. So I'm going to be going over questions that I was asked in real interviews, because I feel like when I was applying for internships there wasn't a whole lot of content out there for what types of questions you might be asked or how you can prepare. So intern season is fast approaching, even though summer just ended. I believe in around September, October, those internship spots start opening up. So hopefully this is perfectly timed for you guys who are preparing to get that first internship. Okay, so for our first interview prompt, I want you to design a component that renders a button and make it so that when a user clicks on that button, it increments a counter variable. And then I also want you to display that counter. So we want to be able to see what the value of that counter is and not just have it saved somewhere. We want to actually be able to see what that count is. So just to get situated here, you'll see that we have this default function app that's being rendered right now. And if we want to see why that is, if we go into the index.js file, we'll see that the app component is the component that's actually being rendered. So if we want to actually see our code, we're going to have to use that component in our app component. So the first thing we're going to do is just start by making a new component. So we'll call it button counter. And then let's just add our return so that we don't forget it. And let's just start off by returning a div. So we know that we have to render a button that a user can click. So let's just go ahead and start with that. So we'll add our button tag and we'll add some text that says click me to increment counter. Cool. So now we know that our task is to increment a counter variable every time this button is clicked. So let's go ahead and start that counter variable. So because we're using a functional component, we can use the useState hook to hook into that React feature and be able to use state in our functional component. So we'll say const counter, set counter, and then we'll set the default value to be 0 because that makes sense. If we have a counter, we should probably start it at 0. And if you're not familiar with useState, it's a fairly new React feature that allows you, like I said, to hook into this feature and ability to use state in a functional component. And basically, you have an array, and the first item there is the actual variable that you're going to be referencing in your code. And the second item is the function or the method that you're going to use to update that throughout your code. So that's kind of the default, or the way that people write it is the first one is the name of the variable, and your second is that set and the name of the variable. So if we were doing something like color, we would have color and then set color. And then in between your parentheses is how you define the default value for that variable. So cool. So now we have our counter. It's starting at 0, and we want a way to increment it every time the button is clicked. So let's actually go ahead and use this in our app function so that we can see it. So we'll do button counter as its own tag, just so we can see how it looks so far. So far, cool. We have a button that says that, and now we want to display the count. So maybe we should display the count above it. So let's just use maybe a p tag and say the current count is, and then remember, if we're going to reference a variable, we have to do it in between these curly braces, so then we can add a counter here. So we see here that it's 0, and that's expected because that's our default value. So now we can go ahead and work on making our functions. Function increment, no arguments. And all we're going to do is use the set counter and take the current count and add 1 to it. Oh, this is counter, not count. So we'll take the counter and then add 1 to it. And then to use this with the button, all we're going to do is add this to be our on-click. So remember, again, you have to use the curly braces, and then here we can just use increment, and now we can test it out. So you'll see that as I'm clicking here, the counter is going up. Cool. So for our next prompt, this is the task. You have to create an image carousel, and an image carousel means that there's a picture in the middle and a button on the left and a button on the right, and when the user clicks that, it should scroll through the images. So kind of like a slideshow. So let's go ahead and start by just downloading some pictures to use in our component. I'm just going to pause this and download a bunch of pictures, and then I'll be right back. Okay, so I've gone ahead and imported my pictures. I just downloaded some dog pictures from the internet, and then you can upload pictures in Code Sandbox by using this up arrow and then actually importing them into your app.js file. So let's stop and think about the problem for a second. So we are to create an image carousel. So that's pretty much just a slideshow where you are having a collection of images, and the user should be able to click a previous and a next button to slide through all of those pictures. So let's think about it. Our collection of pictures should probably be an array, and we should choose an array because we know we have the advantages of being able to choose by index in an array, and it's a pretty simple data structure to work with, and we don't need to overcomplicate it or make this overly complex when it won't help our end goal. So let's just start by making that array and just displaying one of those pictures so you guys can get a feel of what I mean. So we're going to create a new component, and we'll call it image carousel. And let's just go ahead and return so that we don't forget to add our return. And let's just for now add a div in there, and for now just add an h1 hello. Let's make sure that it's rendering correctly. So let's go ahead and use this in our app. Oh, and then sometimes I still forget this, but in React, I'm used to doing camel case because of JavaScript, but in React, your components have to start with a capital letter. So let me go ahead and fix that really quick. Okay, now we should be able to see that hello. All right, perfect, so it's working. So now let's go ahead and set up that array of photos. So let's say let photo array, and then we're gonna use the photos that we just imported. That was the point of importing them. So we can just reference them directly as dog1, dog2, dog3, dog4, dog5, and dog6. Cool, so now we've used all of them. And just to get an idea of what I mean, I'm gonna just render one of these photos. And remember, we chose an array because it has the advantage of the fact that we can grab certain pictures at a specific index, and that's what we're going to take advantage of here. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what I mean. So let's add an image tag, image, and for the source, like aka what's actually going to be displayed, let's just do photo array at the first index. So photo array bracket 0 would take the first item in that array. So that is our dog1 picture here. So cool, we're seeing that it's displaying correctly, so that makes sense. This little error here is that it wants us to add an alt property, so let's just say dog pics for that error to go away. Cool. So now we see this. So basically what we need to add is a button on the left and a button on the right so that you can click left and right and move through these pictures. So let's just add a button, add these buttons to get the full UI kind of down. So this one will be, we'll call this previous. Let's add another button here and call this next. So we see that the button is actually on top and on the bottom, and we can go ahead and fix that in a second. But just so you guys get a feel, you should be able to click this and it should go leftwards or backwards in the array. And then if we click the next button, it should go on to the next one. So if we were to start at the 0th index and then press next, it should display this picture. Next, it should display this picture, and then maybe if we hit previous, it should go back. So that's why we're using an array, because we know it's easy to manipulate an array in that way. So I just edited the size so that it wouldn't push these two buttons to the top and bottom. So cool. Now we have a previous and a next button, and we know exactly what we want. So the way that we can do this is we kind of already did it, right? We basically said here, I want you to show the 0th index, but we want a way to control what this index is and change it with the buttons. So a really easy way that we can do that is by using state. So we can define a state variable called index and then have our function that updates that called setIndex. And then with those buttons, we can use setIndex to update index as we go. So let's set that up, const index setIndex, and then we're going to set the default value to be 0. We'll just start it off at the first one. And instead of hard coding 0 here, we're going to actually just reference index. So it shouldn't change because we set our default value to 0 and we saw that it didn't, and that's great. So now we have to actually write the functions to update these. So we're going to write two, right? We're going to write a previous and we're going to write a next. So in the last example, I showed you guys how to write a function for the onClick method. I'm going to do the same thing here, but I'm going to use arrow functions. And in an interview, you really should be using arrow functions. It shows that you're kind of up to date with JavaScript and you're just following along with the newest updates. So I'm going to go ahead and model that. So we're going to say const and call it previous. We'll just call it prev. And this one takes in no parameters. And all that we want to do here, right, is subtract 1 from the index. But in our case, like right now, we're starting at 0. If we subtract 1, we're going to go to -1, and we don't have a -1 index. So we want to make sure that we add these borders and these checks for our functions. So yeah, we want to say for our previous one, if our current index is 0, then we don't want to go back 1. Let's block that from happening. So let's do that. So let's say if our current index is less than 1, so that means it would be 0, then you can't go backwards, but we still want to actually do something. So this is just a console message, and a user might not read this, so we still want something to actually happen. So maybe what we could do is it should loop all the way back to the end, so it should kind of go backwards. So the way that we can do that is we can say set index, and then do photo array dot length -1. So let's say right here our array has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if we set it to 6 minus 1, we'll get 5, and this will be our 5th index, aka the last one. So basically what's happening is if we are on the 0th index and the user presses previous, it'll just loop all the way back to the end, but it will say a little message, you can't go backwards. This message doesn't really make sense anymore though. So we'll say, we'll move you to the end. Cool. So now we have our previous. Let's go ahead and do the same thing for our next. Const next. Again, this takes no parameters, no arguments, so we can just leave it as that. And then the check that has to happen here is if we are already at the end, we want to loop back around to the beginning. So the opposite of what we just did. So we're going to say if index is greater than 4, meaning if it's already on the 5th one, we are going to set the index to be 0. So that one was pretty easy. We can reference the 0th index directly. And the reason we couldn't do that with previous is because for any array, we don't know how long it is. It might be 5 right now, but it could be 7, it could be 12, and if we hard coded it wouldn't work correctly. But we know 0 is always going to be the first index, so we can hard code that. So you'll notice for both of our functions next and previous, we actually only worked on the different case, or like the case where we're already at the beginning or the end. So now that we've gotten that, the rest of it is super easy. You're just going to go ahead and for previous subtract, and for next add. So we have this if, and then we're just going to say else. If that condition isn't true, then we can just say set index, and for the previous case we'll do index -1. Whoa, I don't know what happened there. We'll do index -1. Same thing here. We'll go here and say else set index equals index +1. So here I added this console log so that we can make sure that it's working correctly. Since I don't remember the order of these pictures, let's just log our index to ensure that it's working properly. So our index is at 0. If we scroll up here, we should see this go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then if we get to 5, it should go back to 0. Perfect. So now let's go previous. We have it at 5, it should go to 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, and then it should go back to 5. Cool, and we see our message. So our buttons are working great. And then finally the last, alright, cool. And then finally the last question today is the following. So I want you to fetch from the GitHub API to get information about a user. And then I want you to display information about that user. So use the response from the request and display some of that information that might be useful for us. So like I said, we're going to use the GitHub API, and this is where I leave a little bit of room for interpretation. And this is a question that I have been asked before, and my interviewer did this. So you might be thinking, okay, how do I know which user to fetch from? How do I know which information do you want me to get? There's millions of users on GitHub. So this is where you as the interviewee would maybe stop and think. There's a bunch of different ways to implement this. You could just hard code your own username. You could make it so that there's a variety of users from a drop-down menu, maybe famous GitHub users, or the way that we're going to do it is for them to type in, have an input box, and then type in a username that you want to fetch from. So I already went ahead and set up the component. Alright, cool. So like I said, the way we're going to implement this is by adding an input box where the user can type in a username, and then we'll fetch information about that user. So we know right away we're going to have to get some information from our user. We want to get the username. What user do you want to make this request for? So that tells me right away we're going to have to use state because we're going to want to save this and persist this all throughout. So let's say const user and then set user. And for this, our default value should be null. Not nil, null. So now we have null. So let's go ahead and get rid of this now since we know our prompt. So we'll make an input tag, and then in our input tag, we're going to have the value is going to be our user. And then for the on change, so basically this is our on change is what's going to happen as soon as someone starts typing, whether it's the first letter that they're typing or the last letter, this is going to keep getting called. So in the on change, we basically want to set our username to be whatever this user is typing. So we'll say equals, and then we have to use our curly braces and say E because we're passing in this event. And then what we want to do is actually set the user, right? So we'll call our set user and then parentheses. And what do we actually want to set it to? Our event.target.value. Cool. And then also maybe what we'll do is we'll just log up here what our user is. Say maybe our current user, and then reference our user variable. So to start off, it should be null. That's what we should see here. Cool, null. And then as soon as we start typing, so see, it's getting updated every time we type. So that means that we are doing this correctly. Our user is getting saved. All right, cool. We can ignore that for now. So now we know that our user is getting saved. That's great. So now we want to actually be able to make the request for this information from the GitHub API. So the way that we are going to do this is by using something called fetch. And if it's not something you're familiar with, it's a pretty simple, straight up concept, but it's definitely something that you should know going into an intern interview. I feel like asking an interviewee to fetch from an API is pretty expected and standard, so you should definitely do this. So the way that we're going to do this is within our component, we're going to create a function, and this function has to be asynchronous because when you're making a request, it takes time. That isn't instant, so it takes time to get that request. So because it takes time, we don't want to be waiting forever for that to come or be trying to display data that hasn't come yet. So that's the reason why we use async await. So let's call it, say, async, and then it's going to be a function, and we'll just call it get user. And then we have to pass in our username. And remember, this can be called anything. It could be called user, it could be called username, it could be called user selected, it could be called whatever you want. It's just a placeholder for what we're actually going to pass. So I'm going to say response maybe equals await, and then that's the keyword await, and then we're going to use fetch. Oh, what was that? Oh, I spelled fetch wrong. Fetch, and then open parentheses, and I'm just going to paste in the URL that we're going to be fetching from. So you have to use the backticks, the URL, and then, whoa, what's happening? Oh, cool. So I have the word wrap on, so it looks kind of funny, but you have the backticks. The base URL is https:/api.github.com/user/username. And this should match what you pass in here, right? Because this is also just a placeholder for what you're actually going to pass. And then after we do this, we actually have to return something. So we have something. So after we do this, because we're using fetch, we have to use the .json on our response. So if you're not familiar with that, just do a quick Google. It's really, really straightforward. So let's do return, and then we're going to await our response.json. And this is a method, so we have to make sure we put on our curly braces. Cool. All right, so now we have this, but now we have it in this variable response. And while that is a way to do it, a better way to do it would be to save this in state so that we could reference this throughout our component. So right now, as you can see, this is just a function that we defined. It's not getting called anywhere though. And if you think about where would be the best place to call this, we want this to happen as soon as our component loads, right? Because we want this fetch to happen as fast as possible so that we can start displaying stuff as fast as possible. So in order to do that, we can use something called the UseEffect hook, which I'm going to import now. And basically the UseEffect hook is a place where you can perform what are called side effects, where you can do things like fetches, and this UseEffect runs on the first load and after every single render. So we're using that to our advantage. We're saying, okay, what do we know happens every time the component loads? Okay, we know UseEffect happens. Let's put our code that we want to execute in there, because we know that's going to happen as soon as the component loads, and we don't have to work on making that happen manually. We know it's going to get called right at the beginning, so let's just stick our code in there. So now in our UseEffect is where we're actually going to call this function that we just defined up here, getUser. So we will do UseEffect, and this is, like I said, another asynchronous function that takes no parameters. So arrow function, and here we'll say request response equals, and then we're going to await that get users, and we're going to pass in our username that we defined in our state. And then with that, we're going to set our response. Then we're going to say set response with request response. So basically we're just saying, okay, hey, for now, put it in this variable. Oops. Put it in this variable, but then I want you to set my response and set it into my response here. Cool. And then the other cool thing about UseEffect is that here you can pass in an array with, in our case, it would be username. And basically what this says is it tells UseEffect, remember we said UseEffect runs on the first time it loads and then every render after that. You can let it know and say, hey, every time this variable changes, I want you to run this again. So that's what we're doing here. We're saying anytime that our username changes, we want you to do a new fetch. Okay, so now let's go ahead and just console log our response. I added that log here just to see if we're getting what we expect. So it's null because our current user is set to null. So let's just look up, I don't know, J-A-Y. There's someone on GitHub is named J-A-Y. And we see here, cool, our response, we're getting information about them, login, ID, their avatar URL, some followers, other stuff here, their name, their full name, their company, and then their location, and a bunch of other stuff. So cool, that means that this is working, and we're actually getting a response. Now we're on to the easy part, which is, let's just render some things that might be important here. So right away, I guess something that could be important is maybe their name. So let's do an h2 tag and do response dot. So let's look here. What is our actual response object? So I know I saw a name. So let's do dot name, because that will give us their first and last name, which is something that we want. Oops. And then remember, when you're doing JavaScript stuff, you have to wrap your statement in curly braces like this so that it actually gets the value and not just the words that you're typing. So cool, we have their name. Maybe we want to display their avatar. I saw that there is an avatar thing that we can show. So let's say source is going to be response dot avatar URL is what it's called. Boom. Shout out to Jay Satiro. What else can we display about him? Maybe let's display his location. That might be something that's interesting. Location. Let's do this in an h3 tag and say location, and then we'll say response dot location. So when we scroll down, we should see that. Cool. So now we're displaying his name. Let's make his image a little smaller. So let's say maybe let's set it to 200. Cool. So that we can get it a little bit smaller and fit more on the screen. And maybe one more thing that we can display is, let's do their company. Or I'm trying to think what could be cool. Maybe their name, their actual GitHub name and not their full name. So let's just add it under their full name. So we'll say maybe maybe just do a p tag, and we'll say username, and then it's response dot login. Oops, and again, don't forget to add these curly braces. Response.login. Cool. So now let's go ahead and edit this. So maybe let's do Josh Joshi. Okay, cool. So Joshi is a user on GitHub. His full name is Josh Lorman, and he's located in Atlanta, Georgia. Maybe let's add one more thing. Maybe their current company. Let's do another H3 tag. Let's say current company, and then braces response dot. I know it was here somewhere. Response dot company. Response dot company. Cool. So Josh Lorman is in Atlanta, Georgia, and he works at Autodesk. And you can see here there's a bunch of other fields that we could display, and you can go ahead and do that, but this just gets the basics down. So cool. So we were able to fetch from an API, we were able to manipulate the response, and we were able to display that response. So we hit all three. Those were all three questions that I had for you guys. Let me know if that helped. Let me know if there's any other questions that you've been asked that you want to go over. And if you haven't already, share, subscribe. It really does make a difference for me. And I'll see you guys next time.